Hello everybody and welcome to Vernacular Verbose. Today we're continuing our deep dive of the Jethro Tull discography, starting with album number 2, Stand Up, released in 1969. My name's Joey Vetter.
And I'm Eugene Manko.
And today we're going to be taking you track by track on Stand Up, a very important album in the Jethro Tull discography, I think most people would say. A lot of people refer to this as the first real Jethro Tull album. Eugene, what do you think of when you imagine the importance of Stand Up to the legacy of Tull and their evolution as a band?
Well, it is definitely the turning point, genre-wise, in the songwriting and the musicianship. Of course, Martin Barre coming on this album also defined the direction that Tull would take later.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's Ian Anderson liberated, right? It's coming out of the shell of that first blues album of This Was, where Mick Abrahams and Ian Anderson had come to a head in the months previously to the writing and recording of this album, where Mick was very much a blues purist who wanted to remain a blues band in the mold of This Was, while Ian wanted to branch out into different kinds of music, including folk music, which he was very influenced by, I think, at this point. And that, of course, resulted in Mick leaving the band. Whether he was fired or whether he quit on his own accord, that's kind of always been up for debate, I think. But I think it was probably one of those situations where they told him, okay, Mick, you're fired. And then he said, well, I'm leaving anyway. You can't fire me, that kind of thing. But that left us with the member lineup on this album of Ian Anderson on vocals, flute, and acoustic guitar, Martin Barre on electric guitar, as you mentioned, Glenn Cornick on bass, and Clive Bunker on drums. So, like you mentioned, it's a huge deal that this is Martin Barre's first appearance with Jethro Tull, and it would, of course, go on to be the next 30, 40 years of his life. So just in that sense alone, it's a huge step forward for the band in coming into their own as a sort of premier band of the 70s, I think.
That's true. I think when I first heard this album, it was on a B-side of a 90-minute tape that had This Was on one side and Stand Up on the other. So as a teenager, I always listened to these two albums like together.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Wasn't separated enough. So at the time, for me, these two albums were kind of a single listening experience. But of course, coming back to it now, it's really very difficult to compare them on an equal footing.
Yeah, I actually kind of like that, though, because it almost is kind of a unique double feature in a way, in that they are very separate and they do feel of different eras of the band's history. But at the same time, as I think we'll get into more in the track by track, there are some transitionary moments, I think, which make it really interesting.
Yeah, there are things where you can hear them developing things they began on This Was.
And I almost kind of wonder if that was more because they wanted to do that, or if they felt like they needed to do it out of necessity. Whether they felt that because they were known as a blues band and because that's what was still mostly popular in Britain, if they felt like they had to retain that influence, or if they did it because that's what they really wanted to do artistically.
I just think that came naturally. It was, in many ways, it still was a natural transition. Of course, it was stark because Ian Anderson wanted to do new things, but you can't, as a musician, as a composer, as a creator, just completely forget what you've been composing and writing up to now and start doing something completely differently. So I think it was the progression of Ian as songwriter, where he took things that he liked about his songwriting from before and applied them to the new genre, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how you would navigate doing that, because I think that's a pretty big challenge to be able to like navigate the fine lines of that. But I think I would say it was done pretty successfully on this album.
I agree. I'll come back to that when we discuss the first track, because I have some thoughts about it.
So a big thing just creatively, like in the technical aspect of this album, was that it was recorded on 8-track, whereas This Was recorded on 4-track.
Yeah.
And just for anybody who's not sort of familiar with the terminology of what that means, it essentially means they had more space on the recordings to use. So they were able to record more instruments or more effects and put them on the tracks and things like that.
It's not just more space, but they didn't have to bounce things down all the time.
Right.
So they had more time to decide what could be added, because I think Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was recorded on a 4-track. So you could cram a lot of stuff when doing a 4-track recording, but you have to have a very good idea all the time of what you're going to add, because every bounce down, you first of all lose quality, and second of all you commit to what you've recorded. You can't then delete it.
Yeah, a very different era from digital recording today, where you have hundreds of tracks you can use at any time and don't need to worry about anything.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember in the Steve Wilson booklet, Ian mentions that specifically, about how that was a big help in sort of bringing Tull and the music into a more creative fashion, as opposed to just the more straight-lined recording like they had on This Was.
Yeah, because it liberates you. It leaves you space for decisions.
Right. And I think there's definitely some tracks on here that make full use of that, as we'll get to later in the track by track.
Mm-hmm.
So this album was a big commercial success for the band. It was arguably sort of, I think, what set them on the path to becoming a huge band later on, a couple albums later. They weren't expecting this album to go to number 1. I think they were touring in the US when it happened. And so it was a big surprise for them, and I'm assuming for Chrysalis Records as well. And it probably launched Jethro Tull to being one of Chrysalis's main acts at the time.
Yeah. What do you think of the cover?
I like it in general. I think, this is one of the sort of classic, iconic Jethro Tull images.
Uh-huh.
It's a little odd and a bit absurd, but I think it's very much sort of the time, like the late 60s. I mean, this was, 1969 especially.
Yeah.
So I think it's very evocative of that style, but I think it's in a way which fits with a band like Jethro Tull and an artist like Ian Anderson, where it's not like a super crazy psychedelic hippie thing, which I think wouldn't have fit, the band very well.
Yeah, but it is kind of psychedelic.
Mm-hmm.
I think it may not be my favorite Tull cover, but it's one of my favorite kinds of cover, because it's got lots of little details that you can examine for a long, long time, and you don't notice them all at once.
Right.
You won't notice them when you're first looking, but then as you continue, you will notice the little ornaments, the little patterns, the fact that Ian Anderson has 6 fingers on one hand.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
The artist's signature on the bottom, all of these little things. And this is the kind of cover that keeps you occupied. You don't just look at it and put it down. You keep looking at it. You keep discovering new things. And this is what I like about it.
I always thought it was interesting how Clive was on the bottom, but I guess that's just what happens when you're trying to plot out something that huge, that just someone has to be on the bottom.
Also, man, drums are the foundation.
Yeah, that too. When I look at it, Martin looks a bit odd on it, but I mean, I guess he was very young at the time, and I suppose he looked different than he did later, so maybe that's just what he looked like back then.
Yeah, and also could be that everyone else sort of already had their own image, their own scenic kind of garb.
Yeah.
That they used already solidified, and people were familiar with them. But Martin was still the new guy.
Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, this was a real woodcut that was actually made by hand. I think James Grashaw was the artist. And I wonder what happened to the actual piece. I wonder if it still exists somewhere.
Oh, actually, it must exist, because what I'm looking at right now is the beginning of the Steven Wilson booklet.
Uh-huh.
And on the first page, there's the cover, the stamped cover, and the wooden piece on the right, mirrored. So it does exist, at least. If that's not an old photo from 1969, I think it must be somewhere in Ian Anderson's possession still.
Okay, I need to look back at the booklet then, because I don't remember that. But so there's an actual photo of the thing in there?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's got the chisels on the photo, so it's very obvious that it's that piece, and it's the woodcut.
Well, I don't remember that. Yeah, I need to look at that, because I was just thinking that I feel like I've never seen a photo of the actual block, but I guess I'm wrong.
It's there, yeah. I'm looking at it right now.
Cool. Well, let's dive in to track 1 on our track-by-track analysis. Track 1, A New Day Yesterday.
It was a new day yesterday, but it's an old day now.
So when I was mentioning transitions between This Was and Stand Up, this is the one track that really comes to mind, I think, where this is a track which is very much rooted in the blues style, but it's also very different, and it's immediately apparent that it's different when you first hear it.
Yeah, it kind of does begin the album in the way, like, here is Jethro Tull, remember us playing the blues? Well, this is what we do with it now.
Right, and not just from the sound, but I think the sound is a huge part of this song. And specifically with the guitar, there's a lot of crazy phaser effects going on.
Yeah, which was achieved in a very creative manner.
Yeah, it was actually a practical phaser effect, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
So the recording engineer, Andy Johns, if I remember right, the story was that he taped a microphone to a pendulum, basically, and sort of swung it in, I guess, like a circle around the amp while they were playing.
Yeah, because they didn't have the ability to plug a guitar into a Leslie speaker. Either they didn't have one, or maybe didn't have the right connectors, something.
And so that alone brings like a new sonic texture that I think was nowhere to be found on an album like this was.
Yeah, and it's so cool how bands were experimenting with physical methods of recording and achieving sounds, and swinging microphones were, of course, pioneered by Steve Reich at the time in the swinging, in the piece where the microphones are swinging and just giving a feedback.
Right.
So very much a spirit of the times.
So not just the guitar tone, but I mean the guitar tone is the standout point of this track, I think, in that it's so heavy and it hits so hard. And I remember reading Martin Barr giving an interview about this album where he said that he was still very young and sort of unsure of what he was doing on this album, and so he didn't find it particularly fun to make this album because he was very, I guess, self-conscious and sort of concerned the whole time.
Oh yeah, that's very understandable.
But I think when you listen to a track like this, it doesn't sound like that. I mean, I think he sounds very much in control, and the guitar really sounds like it's driving the track, and it's very much fitting in where it needs to be.
Yeah, that's true. I like how the harmonica works with the rhythm guitar during the solo. Like they both contribute to the groove,
right,
and not just to the timbre.
And it also plays off of the phaser, and it sort of makes this sort of disconcerting kind of sound, which is, I think, is part of, like a signature part of the sound of this track.
Yeah.
Also, the time signature is a major part of what makes this track unique. I think it's in 6/4. Can you check me, am I wrong?
Well, I'm not sure if you could call it 6/4 or just 6/8, because it does have two very heavy beats, so it's a 2-beat structure. So it doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6. It goes 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, which is the hallmark of a 6/8.
I think that's another thing where even if you're not particularly knowledgeable on music theory, you're not counting or anything when you're listening to the song, but I think you can tell just from the beginning that there's something different and unique about it, and that's another thing which sets it apart from this was in the earlier material.
That's true. I wanted to talk about the lyrics, because to me, when I listened to them and when I read them, it feels like kind of a meta blues. It's thematically still a blues song, but it sounds like a commentary on a blues song rather than a straightforward blues lyric. Or you can look at it in another way. You can imagine that Ian is pretending to be kind of a Victorian era musician who was told about the blues but who had never heard it. Is a little bit detached from being a blues singer. And Ian's lyrical persona, however you look at it, it's removed several layers away from that.
How do you think it's removed?
Well, the choice of words, the phrases, the way they are built, it sounds like a person describing a blues song in words that are not necessarily used in blues songs. So this is why I'm imagining a Victorian era musician, like in a parody play or something. Someone told a Victorian era musician about how to play the blues, and this is what they wrote.
I think what's funny is that that's probably not far off from, I mean, what it really was, in the sense that, like, this is very much one of those songs that Ian, his set is not based on anything, he's just making it up, and I think it's another of those things where he's writing what he thinks blues should be. So I think you're not far off when you say that it's like someone trying to imitate blues.
I don't think he failed at it. I think he did it very intentionally, because he did write much more straightforward blues lyrics on This Was.
Yeah.
But this one is it's a little bit more fanciful with phrases like, "My luck should be so bad now to turn out this way." It's much more British.
Yeah.
And in this way, it kind of creates this interesting image of a meta blues, of blues sung through a prism of a different culture.
And I think that's a great way to describe this track in general, even musically.
Probably, yeah.
For me, this is one of the band's best banger tracks ever. I think the guitar and bass tones are fantastic on it, and they really come together to create what I think is a great opening and one of the best sort of hard songs that the band has ever had. I also think, just to wrap it up, I think the vocals on this song, Ian still sounds very young on this album. And I think this is a very good example of that, where you can really hear his sort of youthfulness, I think, in his voice on a song like this, where it's very expressive.
Yeah, definitely.
Track 2, Jeffrey Goes to Leicester Square.
When I listen to this song, I think it's very much a precursor to Witch's Promise musically, because it has a kind of a very similar musical idea in it. Straightforwardly, the melody. You could hear how experimenting with that kind of melody they got Witch's Promise later. But otherwise, lyrically, I think in this song we are witnessing the birth of Ian Anderson, the social commentator.
Yeah, I agree.
Because it is the first song like this, with lyrics like these from him, which we will get much more of on the later albums.
Right.
Where it's a kind of a detached observer looking at people and singing what they see.
I think that this one stands out to me as being the first truly folk Tull song when you go through the discography. And so in that sense, I think it's like the very beginning of this very long folk tradition, which is really important and sticks with the band for much later. Of course, this is the first time when we really see acoustic songs just with Ian on the album, which again it becomes a very significant part of the Tull material going forward. It's kind of interesting to me that you brought up Witch's Promise, because, well, I think musically they're a bit similar. Witch's Promise to me is much more serious, I guess.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and this track to me is very tongue-in-cheek and not serious, I think on purpose.
Yeah, and I think the music is a big part of that, because as Ian recounts, he wrote it on the balalaika.
Right, yeah.
And it's one of the tracks, as he says, that can only be performed on the instrument it was written on and written for. Which is interesting. I wonder how the balalaika was recorded, because that's, if anyone doesn't know, it's a Russian 3-string instrument similar to a mandolin but triangular. And it's acoustic. You don't get electric balalaikas. You definitely did not get electric balalaikas in 1969. But it sounds kind of overdriven. So I wonder, was it mic'd through a cranked out amp, or maybe just recorded directly into the console but driving the preamp, like the Beatles did on the track Revolution, where all the guitars were just DI'd into the console and overdriving it quite hard. It's interesting because it does sound like an electric instrument, but we know that it was recorded on an acoustic one.
I think that overdriven effect is really important for the track, and it gives it kind of a psychedelic tinge to it. Yeah, which it sort of anchors the album a bit to the time, I suppose. But I think that's really important for sort of establishing the atmosphere of the album as a whole. I really love how joyful it is. It's a really lighthearted kind of free-footed song, and I think the Glenn Cornick plays a great bass line on the song, which I think really helps with that feeling a lot.
Yeah, because it does play off the balalaika lines, and it's so bouncy.
Do you know what the name of the percussion is, or what those are?
When I was writing the notes, I first wrote congas, but then I think in some notes in the booklet or somewhere else, someone mentioned tablas, and I thought, yeah, duh, these are tablas, because they have that kind of dull, slightly duller, less ringy.
Yeah, that sounds right. I'd been wondering for a while the name of the percussion, because this percussion is on a couple of different Tull tracks across the years, and I'd always forgotten the name, but tablas sounds right.
Yeah, I think these are tablas. I like the sparse arrangement of the track. I think it is dictated by the use of the balalaika, because it doesn't have a full sound, so other instruments have to follow suit and are chosen so as not to overpower it. So we don't get a drum kit, we don't get an electric guitar, and everything is kind of careful.
Yeah, I love the flute as well. I think it gives it a really great sort of folk atmosphere in the back.
Yeah.
But in general, that's what this track means to me, is it's sort of the very beginning of the folk Tull.
Yeah, and the fact that it's put as the second track on the album means a lot, actually.
Right, yeah.
This is a statement from them.
Mm-hmm. Track 3, Bourée. So I think this is a very well-known song for anybody who's familiar with Jethro Tull. This is, of course, based on Bach's Bourée in E minor, which is not a song which is unknown among rock musicians. It's been played or practiced by other bands like Paul McCartney and Led Zeppelin. So it's fairly popular, I think, as a rehearsal tool for guitarists.
Mm-hmm.
I think we mentioned on the This Was episode that this was sort of the closest that Tull has ever been to like a jazz or fusion band.
Yes.
And I would definitely agree with this one, because I think this is the kind of track that you could hear in a hotel ballroom or something.
Yeah, because in the later years on live performances, I think Ian started introducing it as a piece of loathsome cocktail lounge jazz.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. And this is a song which has been played live very, very frequently by Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson, or whatever combination you want to name that these days. But this has been played many, many, many hundreds of times, and I think probably nearly every time I've seen Ian, I've heard this song.
Yeah, I've seen Ian twice, and I think he played it both times.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful track. I can't really find faults with it, but maybe it's the one Jethro Tull track I'm a little bit fed up with.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
What do you think about the newer version of this track, where they started introducing it with a little bit of the original Bach melody, where it's twice as fast? It goes ta-da-ti, ta-da-tu, ta-da-tu, da-da-da, and then dropping down to half-time and swing.
I can't say that I prefer either way. I guess I prefer the studio version.
Uh-huh.
But that being said, maybe this is controversial. I don't know. I mean, I think this is a relatively well-liked track for most Tull fans.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I think some of it is probably that I've heard it a lot. And I think I've heard and seen a lot about, its connections to classical music and things like that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But it's gotten to the point for me where this track is actually a bit boring, to be honest. And
well, just because we know it so well.
Yeah, and it's not that I don't respect what they were going for with this track, but for me, it can get to be too much, I think.
It can, yeah, but I mean, it does have one of the best Ian Anderson flute solos on the early albums.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting how you mentioned Paul McCartney, because what I'm always thinking about with regards to this track these days is Paul McCartney used to recall that the first couple bars of this same Bach piece, just the first couple bars, was a party piece that he and George Harrison used to play in the early days of the Beatles to show that they weren't just greasy rock and roll kids.
Mm-hmm.
And first of all, Paul tells the story in connection with the song Blackbird, and says that this piece by Bach was one of the things that inspired the composition of Blackbird. The other thing being, of course, Donovan teaching the Beatles the finger-picking style on the guitar, which begat such songs as Dear Prudence, Mother Nature's Son, Blackbird, and Julia. But the fact that this Bach piece inspired two very important compositions in rock and pop music, like Blackbird and Jethro Tull's Bourée. And second, which is kind of wild to me, is, I am quoting verbatim, Paul McCartney used the words party piece. And when talking about Bourée and Serenade to a Cuckoo, Ian Anderson used the words party piece. What is it about this kind of mindset that they both, I'm sure of it, independently referring to playing these kinds of tunes as party pieces?
Well, I think it goes back to what Ian said about it being a cocktail lounge type piece. And that's exactly what this sounds like to me. It sounds like a hotel ballroom function.
Uh-huh.
I've been to many of those kinds of things where you have sort of a cover band, in the corner who's playing for some, corporate event or something. That's kind of what it reminds me of. I don't mean to sound deriding when I say that. Maybe it sounds that way. To me, that's the kind of vibe that this song gives off. But maybe that's not what it sounded like in 1969, all the benefit of hindsight.
Maybe, maybe not.
One thing I will say, I really like the bass solo in the middle.
Yeah.
I especially like when he starts playing the chords. I think it sounds very different, and it's actually not something that I think Glenn has done very often, so it's a very different style of playing for him.
Yeah, I wonder what inspired that.
Track 4, Back to the Family.
Telephone wakes me in the morning. Have to get up to answer the call. So I think I'll go back to the family where no one can ring me.
Back to the Family. I think this track feels to me like a blueprint for the later Jethro Tull style.
Mm-hmm.
There are several very different elements in a single song. The verse is very distinct from the chorus. There's a interesting break between the verse and the chorus where it's kind of my favorite part of this track, the little 3-4-5-4 breakdown before the chorus slams down hard.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, being a blueprint for the Jethro Tull style, it kind of musically feels to me a little bit basic. There's a groove, there's a flute solo that's just riffing the blues scale, and otherwise it's pretty simple.
Mm-hmm. I kind of had the same feeling, and I was trying to find a word to describe it when I wrote my notes, but I think what you said, basic, I think kind of sums it up. I'm a big fan of this track, personally. I think it's one of the more underrated Tull tracks in general. Not so much for the chorus. I think the chorus is fine, but particularly the verses are really magic to me somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I really like how homely the guitar melodies sound, and I think something about the way that it's sung and the lyrics about going home or coming from like a family situation, something about it kind of wraps it up in kind of like a nostalgic type feeling somehow.
Yeah, interesting if you juxtapose it with 4,000 Mothers.
Yeah, and I mean, I think
lyrically
those two tracks
album
are very related to me for obvious reasons.
Yeah, so this is the kind of a duality, right, where you rely on the comfort of the family, but at the same time there's a lot of resentment can be bottled up.
Ian Anderson has written a lot. I think I've mentioned how he doesn't like to make his lyrics personal or his songs personal.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks
Yes.
it's a better idea to keep personal events and characters out of songs. That being said, I think in early Tull there were a couple of exceptions, and I think a song like this, and I think there's others on this album too, but I think this song is, I'm sure it's somewhat fiction, but it's, if you know anything about Ian Anderson and his sort of personal life and biography, you know that he had a lot of issues with his parents around this time period, and so I think it's not totally surprising to see him write about themes like this.
And I think he mentioned also that in that time period he used to have lots of problems financially,
Mm-hmm.
and this kind of carefree lifestyle that he was deprived of was kind of maybe something that had an allure for him.
Yeah, and I think not even just on this album, but going into Benefit, we'll talk about that more when we get there, but there's a lot of songs he's written about leaving something and going back home to a family, and this is of course the most direct song about that, so that's interesting. I think my guess is there's some kind of personal thing there about that.
Yeah.
But I think in general I agree with what you said about how it is a bit basic in that it's kind of like it's kind of like Smells Like Teen Spirit 30 years prior maybe. It's like the quiet loud verse chorus structure, and there's not a lot more to it than that, but I think for what it is, I appreciate this one a lot.
Yeah, I think it does have it is the building blocks of the Tull genre.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just quiet loud. It's because it's got those little complex rhythms and breakdowns, and a breakdown in an odd time signature.
Yeah.
It really shows what they were aiming for.
Mm-hmm. And it also ends in kind of, I guess, like a stereotypically kind of like psychedelic rocking outro, which I think is fitting of like a lot of not just music at this time in the 60s, but of like Tull as a band at this point too.
Yeah.
Track 5, Look Into the Sun.
So when you look into the sun, see all the things we haven't done. Or was it better than to run and spend the summer?
So this, I think, is one of Ian's best acoustic songs, I would say. And I mean, there's a lot to pick from, but I always thought this is a really pretty song. And I think particularly it would be surprising for maybe Tull fans who had, gotten used to the band of This Was on an album like this to hear a song like this come from them.
Yeah, I do like the way how the acoustic guitar interacts with the piano on this track.
Yeah.
Because they're both playing a very similar part, but it's obviously to the point where they can actually play the same thing, because being such wildly different instruments.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't, if you listen to it, if you really take notice of what both instruments are playing, you realize that this is the same part,
right,
on two different instruments. But I think in the Steven Wilson remaster, these are panned very hard, and they kind of feel like two different parts,
mm-hmm.
but they are the same part on two different instruments. I don't know. I'm going on about this. Probably
no, I see what you mean.
It is.
Because, I mean, a piano is a rare instrument for Tull anyway at this point. You know, there wasn't a piano player in the band yet.
Mm-hmm.
I think the piano was played by Ian on this part. And there's a certain atmosphere that this whole song has, which I think the piano contributes some of it. I think the way the guitar is played contributes some of it. I think whatever the vocal effect is contributes a lot to it. There's a sort of like a little glitchy sounding vocal effect, which
mm-hmm.
gives it kind of like an otherworldly quality, I think.
Yeah, I think it's sort of flanged or phased.
Mm-hmm. To be honest, one thing I don't like about this track, to be honest, is I think the electric guitar wah solos are a little unnecessary. What do you think?
They do feel separate.
Yeah.
Well, they must be, because they have obviously been an overdub.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, as I was listening to it, I was thinking, does this guitar contribute a lot to the track, or is it just there to occupy some space? But it doesn't really take away from it either. So it's a very odd musical choice, because the voice of the guitar with the wah pedal being so a little bit annoying at times. But it kind of surprised me that the guitar sounded like that and didn't really detract from the other musical elements.
To me, it almost kind of sounds like something that they gave to Martin because he didn't have anything else to do on the track, and so they just had him overdub sort of like stereotypical 60s like wah solos like that. I think they get better as the track goes on, and I think he sort of swells a bit, and it contributes more to like the build up and the atmosphere of the track. But
yeah, I agree.
I think particularly in the beginning when it's sort of quieter, I think there's just kind of random guitar solos happening in between verses and things, which it doesn't fit super well to me.
In this track, I think the chorus, the time signature in the chorus, is kind of an example for me of what will become typical for Ian Anderson songs. You can say that the song is in 3/4, but the chorus is also in 3/4. If you wrote it down on a piece of sheet music with a 3/4 time signature, everything would resolve. But the accents actually divide the chorus into first a bar of 5, then followed by a bar of 4, then followed by a bar of 3. So it's got this 5-4-3 pattern, which then resolves to 12 beats and fits into 3/4. So you don't really notice it happening, but this is kind of, I think, to me, a typical Ian Anderson rhythm, where it's not defined by the grid, it's defined by the lyrics and his own musical feel.
Do you think that was intentional, or was it just played naturally that way?
I always wonder that.
Yeah, I wonder the same thing with Tull stuff.
About Tull stuff, yes, because I think it was natural, because that's the way the lyrics fit into the chorus. It's interesting to me how they still fit into the same time signature in the end, because with Ian's songs, sometimes they don't.
Mm-hmm. I think the lyrics on this track are great, and I love kind of how the post-chorus keeps changing the line about summer.
Mm-hmm.
I like how that changes every time. It's sort of like an update on the story, and I think, like I said, it's one of the prettiest Tull songs ever, I think, and I think the lyrics do a really great job with that, even though, whatever the subject matter is almost certainly made up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. This is not based on any real experience.
Mm-hmm. One kind of last little random fun fact about this song is that the bass is not played by Glenn Cornick, it's played by Andy Johns, the engineer, just because Glenn Cornick wasn't there that day, because I guess you don't need him for like an acoustic track. And this was also the last track recorded for the album, which I think would also probably be why he wasn't around, but it's just sort of a little fun fact.
Yeah, and Andy Jones played a fretless bass on this track, which you can hear in some places that it's a fretless, so it does lend a certain interesting kind of color.
Mm-hmm. Track 6, Nothing Is Easy.
Nothing is easy, the time gets you that's okay. Just take your life easy and stop all that hurrying, be happy.
Well, great song. I feel like Nothing Is Easy is sort of a more mature development of the rhythm and the groove that Jethro Tull used in My Sunday Feeling.
Yeah, I agree.
On This Was, because they sort of have the same rhythmic idea, but Nothing Is Easy develops this musical idea with such greater power and makes it much more diverse, rather than just holding on to it for the entire song, because it's got intros, it's got the cool down, sort of brilliant cool down after the solo, like a two-staged affair.
Yeah, I agree with the connection to My Sunday Feeling. It's always kind of felt like a sibling of that song, sort of. And even also with the drum part, because the drum parts on those two songs are fairly similar in the style they're played, where Clive is again doing his sort of octopus thing where he's playing his left hand just like everywhere all at once.
Yeah.
And I think this song is a lot better, though, than My Sunday Feeling, I would say.
Definitely, yeah.
I used to not really care for this song as much when I was a kid, but I think I've kind of grown into it over time. One of my favorite things about it is the bass line. I think it's one of the best Glenn Cornick bass lines ever.
Probably.
And it may not be something that you sort of pick up on when you first listen to it. I think you kind of have to catch your ear to it after a while. But what the counter melody that he's playing in the verses, I think, is just so addicting, and it really gives a lot more like latitude to the track as a whole.
Yeah. So one thing that I believe this track is not as good as it could be is in the coda, which is pretty fun, where they do this kind of 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. On the final, very, very final punch, it kind of underdelivers, and I think it only underdelivers on the record, because I could imagine how powerful it could sound in a live situation. But with so many kind of fake out final punches that they do, the very final one could stand to be even more powerful. I don't know if they made more overdubs on it or something like that.
Yeah, I was going to mention that this is one of those songs that you can tell very obviously was a live song.
Yes. That
they brought into the studio. Because I think on a studio track, you wouldn't typically be, kind of playing around with all the fake outs and the 1, 2, 1, 2, 3s. I run a drum YouTube channel, Better Drums on YouTube, and I did a drum cover of this song. I'm trying to do a couple of Tull covers every month or so. And this song, of course, it was very fun to learn, but it was difficult because of what you said, those fake out endings where kind of all that I had to go off was just I could kind of hear Ian's breathing in the flute in my left ear, and that was kind of all I had to go off.
I believe that in a live situation that this is what everyone would have to go off. Maybe he would also just wave his hands around.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot to say about this track, but this is one of the standout tracks on the album for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's one of those tracks similar to A New Day Yesterday where you can still tell there's very much a blues jazz influence there, but it's just in a much more interesting and like wide open way than it was on This Was. It almost, progressive is a word that's used a lot with Jethro Tull, but I think it's almost sort of getting into like a progressive blues or jazz style territory.
Yeah, probably. I don't think really there's a lot of what we would today call progressive rock on this album. But yeah, they are definitely dipping their toes in that pool. And of course, it being 1969, there wasn't a pool to dip into. This is one of the albums that actually defined the directions that progressive rock would take.
Yeah, I agree. Track 7, Fat Man.
Don't want to be a fat man. People would think that I was just good fun. Would rather be a thin man. I am so glad to go on being one.
So this is a funny song. I mean, it's supposed to be funny, of course, but this is another of those songs that I think it's the beginnings of the folk Tull. Although I think this is folk in a different way than the Jeffrey track is.
Yeah.
It's almost, it's very British in a way. I kind of get that feeling, that it's a bit more of like a traditional British folk song.
Yeah, probably. I think it being a song that was written on the mandolin, we don't get too many songs in the Tull discography that are so heavily mandolin oriented. The other one that springs to mind straight away is Big Riff and Mando, about the stolen mandolin. And I think they do like using this kind of musical language where they couple mandolins with the hand percussion and an overall lighter kind of arrangement.
I think, this song needed like a light, or not this song, this album needed a lighter song like this. So I think this song, it kind of helps balance out some of the rest of the album. Not that the rest of the album is super serious or anything, but just that having kind of like a for fun, really lighthearted track, I think it helps the album quite a bit.
Comic relief.
Right, yeah. Which, the comic relief in the lyrics, this song is apparently written about Mick Abrahams.
Allegedly.
Yeah. And Ian has sort of said something about how that if it is written about Mick, it isn't meant to be in, an insulting way, although I don't really know how you could take it any way other than insulting, I guess. So,
yeah, and it could have been one of the things that drove them apart in the end, or not. Ian is always very vague when he's talking about this.
Yeah, I think he's kind of vague whenever it comes to talking about people leaving the group, but I think, particularly with this one, yeah, it's a pretty slimy thing to do if it really is about Mick, particularly given that he just left the band. But
I don't think it was written when Mick just had left the band. I think it was still written while he was in it.
Yeah, just to put it out on your next record.
Yeah.
I like the percussion a lot. I think it's bongos on the song. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, must be.
Played with sticks.
With Comic Relief, I think they, on live performances, they use it in the same way, because I think they change around. They change the instruments around on it, and the drummer, whoever is playing the drums at the moment, comes to the front of the stage to play the bongos, and it's kind of used in that same way as on this album, just to be an interlude.
Yeah, and I like sort of humming along to the main mandolin line from the vocals. I think that kind of it helps give the track more like a down home feel, I guess, and I think that's kind of what this track is supposed to be accomplishing at the end of the day.
Yeah, it does have that kind of entertainer George Formby sort of feel.
Track 8, We Used to Know.
Could be soon we'll cease to sound. Slowly upstairs, faster down, then to revisit stony grounds.
So with Hotel We Used to Know, I think in this song, the flute solo, it's very short, but it feels to me like one of the most powerful solos on the album. It's the most technically advanced. It has very, very fast runs, and it feels at the same time, the most technically effortless. The very few bars where Ian is playing the flute solo is kind of a standout moment to me on this track, and it's a bit of a shame that I think on the Steven Wilson remaster the flute is a little bit buried. It sounds a little bit far away, doesn't punch as much as on the other variants, which is kind of to me an odd choice. What do you think about the whole We Used to Know / Hotel California debate?
So, I'll be honest, this isn't a topic that I've gone out of my way to be an expert on, just because to be honest, I just don't care that much. But, my guess is that it wasn't a direct ripoff, but, maybe it was, I don't know, who knows. But I certainly don't think there's any ill will about it. I don't think there's been any lawsuits or anything.
Yeah, of course, I don't think Ian cares a lot either. And Hotel California was written in, 1976 or a little bit earlier, but definitely not in 1969. I think the fact was that Jethro Tull had toured with Eagles, and Eagles would have heard the song. The chord progression, which is the main, very, very similar element in both songs, it is kind of a typical sequence that you could come up with just strumming chords on a guitar.
Yeah, it's nothing super creative.
Yeah, but I still think that there could have been an influence. It could have been an inspiration. Guitarist from Eagles who wrote it could have just started playing it and had, without recognizing that he was playing We Used to Know, he latched onto the sound because it sounded nice to him.
Yeah.
And the reason why it sounded nice could have been because he had heard it in We Used to Know. And I'm not an Eagles fan. I much prefer We Used to Know to Hotel California. I know many people will disagree with me, but that's okay. In fact, it kind of has always surprised me how big Eagles used to be in the US. Because easily explained, my surprise is easily explained because Eagles aren't very popular in Eastern Europe. So Hotel California is the only song people know here from them. And it almost looks from here as if they were a one-hit wonder, which they of course weren't, because they were huge.
Yeah.
But just we have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know how popular the Eagles are today, but one of their greatest hits albums was like one of the best-selling albums of all time or something at one point.
Yeah, so it just shows how much geographically you can have very different idea of what an artist is.
I think that whole scandal would have been a bigger deal if We Used to Know was like a big popular Jethro Tull song, but just the fact that it's just kind of like a deep cut album track, it doesn't bother many people.
Yeah.
I'll say I like this song, but I don't love it. There's nothing about it that kind of attaches it to me. I think it's most notable just because the lyrics are explicitly personal, where, you know, previously we've talked about how Ian doesn't write about personal situations, and this is very clearly an exception where he's talked about how this song is directly about a period in his life a couple of years ago.
Yeah, the shilling spent line referring to the meter that was used to heat up the apartment.
Yeah.
Where he didn't have the money to heat up the apartment he lived in, and the water froze overnight in a cup.
And in that respects, I guess I'm the kind of person who I don't really pay a lot of attention to lyrics when I listen to music, as weird as that may sound. To me, lyrics are sort of always second to music. But I'm kind of the opinion that regardless of whatever the intended lyrical meaning is supposed to be of a song, I think it's more important that the listener can sort of can find their own meaning and apply it to themselves and their life and that kind of thing. So in that sense, I think this song kind of accomplishes that because, you know, I mean, anybody can think of days they used to know that they much prefer today to those days. So I think that's kind of successful on that front.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the lyrics, if you look at them and if you read them, there's a lot of anguish.
Yeah.
But if you listen to the vocal delivery, there's not a lot of it. It's the typical kind of Ian Anderson's a little bit detached manner of singing.
Yeah.
But instead, all of that lyrical anguish is in the flute solo and the guitar solo.
Yeah, you're right.
There's a lot of it in there. And it's interesting how the music takes the feeling from the lyrics and develops it.
Yeah, I agree. I've never really thought about it that way before.
I think American musician and YouTuber Ben Levin recently said, "Lyrics make you think thoughts, music makes you feel feelings, songs make you feel thoughts." And this is the kind of example of a song where this is a little bit divided into two different parts. First, you've got the lyrics, which you listen to, but which are not sung in a very emotional manner. It is emotional. I'm not saying it is dispassionate, but it still doesn't have that amount of anguish that you get just from reading the lyrics.
Yeah.
But then the instruments take that and bring it up to 11.
Yeah, I like how it grows and grows like that, because it very much does climax at the end, where it kind of brings forth that anguish that you're talking about.
I think musically it also helps that the chord progression is structured in a way where it doesn't really end.
Yeah.
It goes around and around and around.
Although I'd have to say that I'm not a huge fan of the wah guitar solos. I think that it dates it a little bit, I think too much to the 60s. Although I get that, you know, I mean, some amount of guitar is necessary at the end to kind of climax it up.
Yeah, I think the guitar is all right. If you compare the guitar solos on We Used to Know in Hotel California, which is a completely meaningless exercise, but the guitar solo on We Used to Know kind of sounds chaotic, but it also, that's kind of the point with the anguish that I talked about. If it was super harmonically perfect, it would have had less of an impact.
Yeah, I think it
that's
probably
the kind of distraught feeling of the person who has lived through these times.
Right. Track 9, Reasons for Waiting. So I think this kind of strikes me as one of the sweetest Tull songs, and that, you know, it's a very tender song. It's kind of treated with a lot of care, I think. I love the differently pitched flutes. I don't know how else I would describe that, but sort of the different kinds of flutes that are playing the main melody. I think that's kind of the main standout of this track to me.
I think played by Ian Anderson and Martin Barr.
Yeah, that's interesting how it's not just Ian overdubbing.
Yeah, because when they started, they both played the flute, and just over the years, Martin did it less and less. But he was a flutist. I
think the flutes parts really like help kind of create that like tender sort of like blanket atmosphere that this track has. I think the other thing also is the organ, which is kind of odd that there's an organ on this track, and I think what it plays, it's playing very sparsely, and I think it's doing that specifically to try to, you know, bring a certain kind of atmosphere.
Yeah, just adds a little kind of pillow to the sound. But what stands out for me, of course, on this track is the strings. Because, oh my God, the strings! This is another D. Palmer arranged song on the early albums, and I don't know, the strings just elevated from a quiet, tender lyrical aside to a work of art.
Yeah, I was going to mention that too. The strings are fantastic at the very end. It really brings it. You know, I think that's one of the things that I think 8-track probably helped them a lot with.
Yes, just that the dimension that the strings bring into the track. If you think about those strings, it's kind of obvious that when you add a string arrangement to a track, the track feels bigger, because a string orchestra does have a sense of space about it, because we associate strings with space and concert halls, and second, there is the mere sound of the strings has a lot of overtones. It's very rich, and it adds a lot to the harmonic content of the music. And I think that this is achieved very well, because from a very chamber kind of small sounding song with the flutes playing very close to your ears, the flute duet, very quiet flutes that you can hear very well, they convey the feeling of a small space. And then the song in the second half, with the strings kick in, it just opens up. I don't know if I'm making a ton of sense here.
No, yeah,
this is the feeling that I'm getting from it.
That's the same description I would use, is that the strings, it's very much like kind of an explosion almost, in that it starts very slowly, and then, well, not slowly, but it starts very quiet, and then it very quickly kind of blossoms out into something else.
Yeah, and this makes this track absolutely beautiful for me.
One thing I wanted to ask you about this one is, so after the chorus, I think, the choruses, there's sort of this little fast part that the flute and organ are playing together, the do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Is that kind of awkward to you?
No, I don't.
Because it kind of stuck out to me as a little strange, just to kind of have that part in there. It feels a little out of place to me.
I know what you're talking about, but I don't really think it's out of place, because this is the kind of playful things that Jethro Tull do. If they are making a very sweet song, they will attempt to make it less saccharine by inserting these kinds of odd-sounding rhythmical motifs into it. And I think it's one of the things that Jethro Tull do. When they write a very sweet-sounding melody or sweet-sounding song, they will make an attempt to put it into perspective, and to not to drown the listener in sugar by whatever means they have, and making little fun things like that. I think is one of the ways they achieve that.
Maybe it's just me then, but it always sounded a bit strange to me on a song like this, kind of like a slower, sweeter type.
Well, maybe that this is because Ian is a little bit self-conscious about writing like straightforward, sweet music.
Yeah. Track 10 for 1,000 Mothers.
Did you hear mother saying I'm wrong, but I know I'm right? Did you hear father calling my name into the night?
I really, really love how hard rock this song feels.
Yeah.
I think on it, the flute sounds appropriately angry, really complementing, again, like in We Used to Know, it's complementing Ian's customarily detached vocal delivery, which is emotional but not too emotional. He's not screaming, he's not shouting.
Yeah.
But the overdriven, the scat flute, especially in the very overdriven part in the middle before the drum break, it delivers all of the emotion that you can feel when listening to the lyrics.
Yeah, I agree that like this is a very emotion-laden song, and I think a lot of that comes from, like we mentioned, this is another of those songs that I think is very personal, just you can tell from the lyrics, and it's a bit angry, which, you know, Ian Anderson doesn't get angry, I don't think, in his songs often, but this is maybe one of the closest he gets to that. And a lot of the playing, particularly like you said on the flute, I think brings a lot of that out.
Yeah, I think Ian mentions, when talking about this song, Ian mentions a lot the fact that this is an angry song, but it wasn't the anger that he really felt about his parents. So it is still a character that he's portraying. There is a little bit of truth to these feelings, but it wasn't, definitely never was as intense as portrayed in this song.
Yeah, it seems to me like a line like "telling me I'll never be what I am now" is quite direct, though.
Well, yeah. Still, we don't really know if this is anything that he had actually heard from his parents. Maybe that was an impression that he got. An impression that no one believed in him.
Yeah.
But as I said, he even was a little bit apologetic, talking about this song, that this is not the anger that he actually felt, that this is theatrics for the sake of song.
It's kind of an odd choice to me to end the album on. Do you think that?
I don't know. It's a very hard rocking track, and I think the album does begin on a powerful rock song like A New Day Yesterday, and it ends on a musically even kind of more powerful. I'm not saying necessarily better or worse. This is not the point I'm making. I'm just talking about the sound, the delivery, the arrangement of it.
Yeah, it doesn't strike me as a concluding song. I think there's other tracks I would have picked on this album to end it maybe, but it's I don't think it hurts the album or anything, but it just strikes me as an interesting choice for the closing and not one I would have picked.
Well, maybe it did feel to them to that ending on a track, that ending on a high note that asks for continuation was a thing they wanted the listeners to feel. That maybe they wanted people to want more.
Yeah.
Or they wanted to make the point that this is only just the beginning.
The drums are a big part of this song, and it's funny, I've read an interview with Clive somewhere once where he said he didn't like this drum part.
Yeah, all the cymbal stuff.
Yeah, he said like it was just weird or something, and I think he actually singled this one out as like the one drum part that he made that he didn't like or he wasn't satisfied with or something.
Yeah, and that he didn't want to own up to it, just remove me from the credits and all that. I don't know, I like the drums on this song. I think I'm not saying it's an overreaction from Clive, because obviously as the author of the drum part, he is perfectly entitled to love it or not love it, and to think whatever he wants about it. But as to a listener, I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely weird, but it's funny to me that he would single this one out, because I think there's plenty of weird Clive Bunker drum parts that he could have picked, but he picked this one.
Oh, maybe this is not the kind of weird he was going for.
Yeah.
Maybe this is an experiment that he ended up not liking.
Yeah, but I like the sort of central drum part of the very beginning, where he's sort of playing the bell of the cymbal and then going to the toms and back. And it's been kind of cool to see like other Tull drummers through history kind of interpret that a part like that. One question I had about this song is, do you think it would have been better if the guitar was following the main flute melody instead of whatever that keyboard thing is in the back? Because the guitar is just kind of like looping a little rhythm part the whole song.
Well, it does give it a certain sense of urgency, that guitar part. And maybe if the guitar was following the flute, it would have sounded more like the other kind of rocking tracks on this album, like A New Day Yesterday and Nothing Is Easy. But the fact that the guitar is doing that makes this track kind of stand out, and maybe it contributes to to what you feel about it as being not a concluding track, because it leaves you with a sense of something unfinished.
Because I think your ear sort of expects the guitar to be playing that main melody, but it never does in the studio. I know I've seen a couple live versions where they've changed that, where the Martin actually plays the melody line. But
interesting.
I think the flute driving the melody is actually good, I think, but it's still kind of throws your ear for a loop, I think, because the guitar isn't really playing what you'd expect, I guess.
Yeah, but that's kind of what makes it special.
Yeah.
And it leaves a lot of space for the flute to be very, very angry and very raw.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
Just to crank into an overdriven amp with all Ian can muster.
The different outro is kind of cool, where they do kind of the fake out thing, and then that little drum part comes back, and they go into a very different sounding outro, which is kind of cool, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of a hidden track before hidden tracks were.
Yeah, it's kind of has that kind of feeling.
I'm sure they weren't the first to do a thing like this, but it certainly wasn't a popular gimmick at the time. So yeah, maybe that's the kind of feeling they want you to have at the end. Not just having this very angry track capping off the album, but also it finishing in a very ambiguous way. So this was very much intentional, I think.
Yeah, I think the different outro, it almost kind of has like a looping feel. I think it's a fade out, so it kind of has that sort of eternal feel to it.
Yeah, it just fades out. It's not looping, but this is certainly an interesting way to end an album.
Yeah,
and I don't know. I don't think Ian has talked about it a lot.
This is
choice.
I think it's a little bit of a forgotten song. I think it's not really talked about that often, I think, but this is one of the songs that I would most like to hear the band play live, like, back in the golden days or whatever it is. I think it'd be a great live song.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, stand up. So, Eugene, I'm going to ask you, what are your top 3 tracks?
Top 3 tracks. It's been difficult to pick out the top as well as the bottom tracks on this album, because I don't think this album has any of my top Jethro Tull songs ever, even though the album is very good. I don't want to make, stand-up fans angry by saying this. So my top 3 tracks, they would be For 1,000 Mothers, because I love how hard-rocking this song feels and how powerful it is. It would be Reasons for Waiting, just because, I don't know, maybe I'm a Deep Armor fan. And it's just, it's a beautiful track. And for the third track, kind of a difficult choice. Probably a difficult choice between Jeffrey Goes and Look Into the Sun.
Okay.
Because both of these are sort of a more weird folk sounding songs which stand out on Stand Up. And, well, for the sake of controversy, let's say Jeffrey Goes to Leicester Square.
I wasn't expecting you to name that one. That's pretty interesting.
I don't know. It's weird. It's lovely. It's very different. It sets a very different mood at the very beginning of the album. I love it for it.
My top 3, I think, would be A New Day Yesterday, just because I think it's one of the biggest bangers that the band ever had, and I think it really encapsulates sort of the raw youthfulness of the early band. Back to the Family, there's something about it that I think is really kind of enchanting, and it's kind of in a nostalgic way, and it's a little hard to describe, but something about it feels kind of charming and nostalgic, and I think it's a bit underrated. Lastly, I would pick Look Into the Sun. I think it's the best acoustic track on the album, and I think it's one of Ian Anderson's finer sort of moments as a singer-songwriter, even though it was kind of right at the beginning of when he was developing that.
Yeah, I think great choice as well. Look Into the Sun was one of my possible choices. What about the bottom tracks? What are your bottom tracks?
So I only picked 2. I couldn't pick 3. I think this album is good enough to where I don't really think there's 3 tracks worth signaling out. But maybe this is a controversial one, but I would pick Bourée as one of my bottom 3, just in that it's a bit long-winded for me. It doesn't hold my attention very well. I appreciate what they were trying to do with it. It's very clear to me that Ian likes that song a lot, which I think is why it's been played so long. So and that's great for him if he likes that song. But for me, it's just a bit too dull for me. And the second one I would pick probably pick We Used to Know. And I don't think it's a bad song by any means. I like listening to it. Just again, it's a little bit of a lull, I think, in the track listing, to where things just kind of slow down a bit too much. Although I think in general it's not a bad song.
Interesting, because for me, We Used to Know comes quite close to the top tracks on the album.
Okay.
And I also had a hard time picking 3 bottom tracks, and I'm only completely sure about one bottom track, and it's Fat Man.
Huh. Wow.
I don't really love that song. And for the choice of at least the second bottom track, I have a lot of question marks here. One of the songs with question marks is Bourée. Mm-hmm. So it kind of feels mean to put it into the bottom track like that, because it's actually it's a great track, but for the reason that to me it's a little bit overplayed. I think I will put it there just so we both can agree on something.
Well, I feel bad for Fat Man. That's such a charming little song, and you had to savage it.
Well, have to pick something.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was difficult to really single out top tracks and bottom tracks on this album, and I think it kind of sums up my experience with it. It's not my favorite Tull album. It's far from being my favorite Tull album, and it's far from being my least favorite Tull album. So it's a very, very solid work. But I'm kind of always surprised by people who say this was and Stand Up are Tull's best albums. Or even worse, Jethro Tull are above all a blues band. Believe it or not, I see this a lot in the comment sections on Facebook and YouTube and so on. And it kind of baffles me, how could you entirely ignore the way that they grew since then? Both of these albums to me are kind of very raw, and there's yet none of the brilliance and refinement that all of these musicians exhibited on their later work. I mean, like, Stand Up is Tull's best album. Have you really tried listening to Minstrel in the Gallery?
So this is a very controversial thing you're saying here, I think, because
I know.
I was going to bring up that I think in context, of how this album, the legacy of this album is, this is considered like a legendary Tull album, I think. Maybe not everybody says it's their favorite album. I know there's plenty of people who do. But I mean, certainly it's considered like, the upper rafters of Tull albums. So it's interesting to hear you saying that.
I think a lot of it is due to the fact how this album was perceived back in the day when it came out. I think it must have been like a bomb going off.
Yeah,
of course, it would have been absolutely fantastic. It sounded like nothing had ever sounded at the time. But having the experience of the entirety of Jethro Tull discography, I can't in good faith pick it out to be my favorite album.
For me, I happen to agree with, I guess, the consensus that this is a top tier album. For me personally, there's a top 5 of the Tull discography. There's 5 albums that I think are in sort of a league of their own above all the others. And as we go through to our episodes here, I'll sort of reveal what those are. But one of them, I think, for me, is certainly Stand Up. I think this is a top 5 of the whole discography. That being said, it's probably the one I would rank the least among those top 5. I think there's other albums that are better than this one. That being said, I think the reason this sticks out so much for people is because it's a very strong album very early in their career. And for people who like early Tull, I think this is like the best example they have of it. And I also think that it's a very accessible album, and a lot of Tull albums are not very accessible. So this is a good like all-around album that you can recommend to somebody who's just getting into Tull for the first time or something, where they won't be sort of scared away by the more progressive or like heady aspects of later Tull stuff. But at the same time, it still has like really strong material on it for people to latch onto.
Yeah, I do understand that. I know this is what I like most about Tull is the more progressive and heady and kind of crazy things they did. So I don't have a problem with people liking Stand Up, but from my perspective, I can't imagine myself being that person. That's all.
That concludes our discussion on Stand Up. Thank you, everybody, for listening again. We appreciate all your listenership and support. We're both very new to podcasts. We're still figuring stuff out, but we're excited about continuing the podcast, and we think that Tull fans around the world can kind of join in on the discussion. So Please let us know, what are your top 3 tracks on Stand Up? What are your bottom 3? What are we wrong about? What are we right about? Let us know, vernacularverbose@gmail.com. Thank everybody for listening, and look forward to the next episode, Benefit.
Right. Goodbye from me. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.